Abraham Lincoln warned that the philosophy of the schoolroom in one generation will be the philosophy of government in the next. Would you like to know what's being taught in today's classrooms? Welcome to Say What? With attorney Mark Schneider and Pastor George Rosca Jr. They'll explore the issues facing children, parents, and society as a result of the public schools and the forces behind them. Say What is the radio program of Protect Our Kids, which seeks to inform and equip concerned citizens about the looming crisis in American education. So listen in as your hosts, Mark Schneider and George Rosca Jr., unpack the issues and organizations affecting our children. And now here's your hosts, Mark Schneider and George Rosca Jr.
Hello everyone, I'm George Rosca.
I'm Mark Schneider.
And we want to welcome you to today's episode 164 of Say What, where we talk about the threats to our children in the public school system, including the horrific social contagion that's seducing girls in the Western world into identifying as trans.
That's right, George. We covered part one of this topic last week, but we want to continue with a very important conversation about what is called the CASS report that was recently published in England. In April of 2024, the publication of the largest review ever undertaken in the field of transgender health was led by Dr. Hilary CASS, who was the former president of the United Kingdom's Royal College of Pediatrics. This report was commissioned by Britain's National Health Service, which is called the NHS, with the stated goal of figuring out how best to help, this is the goal, the growing number of children and young people who are looking for support from the NHS in relation to their gender identity. And the findings, George, of this 4-year review were written up in a 388-page report, which, as The Economist put it, is damning of practices that were commonplace in England until recently and remain widespread in other countries, notably in America. The CASS report discredits 4 widely believed claims, 2 of which we covered last week, which the first of which was that adolescent gender dysphoria does not predict lifelong experience, and second, that puberty blockers don't merely buy time to think. So if you want to hear more about those, listen to the episode of last week. But George, what are we going to talk about this week?
So we're going to cover the next 2 discredited beliefs. First one being that puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones are, quote, life-saving medicines. And the second one is that the exponential rise in trans identity in recent years is not explained by greater societal acceptance. Again, both of these, as the first 2, Mark and I have been talking about for a long time. We've presented other reports and other meta-analyses, and here it comes. We see yet again from another reputable organization that they are backpedaling on just the complete horrors that the medical establishment has been pushing in countries all across the world. And finally, Mark, and we mentioned this in last week's episode, one of the major things that the CASS report tries to conclude on is that we need to be having a very different kind of conversation about these things. In fact, the first thing is we should be having a conversation because every time you bring up any of these things, all of a sudden you're labeled as transphobic and you're yelled out of the room. But the CASS report really emphasizes the need to have a conversation, even on things that we deeply disagree. And this is definitely one of them. But the question becomes why? Why should we be having a conversation on things that we deeply disagree on? Well, in this particular case, it's because we are talking about the life and the future of our children. And we can't be doing medical experiments on our own children. If you're an adult, you want to identify as trans, you want to take certain drugs to change and morph who you think you are into who you think you should be, have at it. But if you're an adult, and especially if you are a doctor and you are pushing a particular agenda, then I think we should be having a different kind of conversation. And so let's dive into the first point that we want to talk about today, and that is that puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones are not life-saving medicines, Mark. You want to talk to us about that?
Yeah, I mean, this is a common trope you hear from the gender-affirming care medical lobby. Puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones are frequently billed as life-saving interventions. Parents of trans-identifying kids are often asked, this is literal, George, would you rather have a living daughter or a dead son, or vice versa? It has been suggested that hormone treatment reduces the elevated risk of death by suicide in this population, the CASS report observes. But the evidence, George, that the CASS report found does not support this conclusion. Far from confirming the medical health benefits of puberty blockers, the preliminary findings from the UK's 2011 early intervention study suggested that puberty blockers can make the mental health of some people worse, not better. The study, quote, did not demonstrate improvement in psychological well-being, and in fact, some birth-registered females had a worsening of internalizing problems, including depression, anxiety, based on parental report. Troublingly, in response to the youth self-report scale, there was a significant increase after 1 year on treatment in adolescents scoring the statement, quote, I deliberately tried to hurt or kill myself, as sometimes true, especially among birth-registered females. So here's the question, George. So why is it so widely believed that puberty blockers are life-saving?
So the CASS report explains that there are many reports that puberty blockers are beneficial in reducing mental distress and improving the well-being of children and young people with gender dysphoria. And these have been used to put doctors under pressure to continue prescribing such treatments on the basis that failing to do so will put young people at risk of suicide. But the systematic review on which the CASS report draws found that the quality of these studies is poor. And this kind of statement we will find over and over throughout the CASS report, because once again, ideologically driven entities, organizations like WPATH, the Human Rights Campaign, Planned Parenthood, like to cherry pick the studies that purport to support their claims. But most, if not all, of those studies have been discredited as being of very poor quality. So one of the difficulties that the CASS report points out in studying gender therapy outcomes is that so many young people who are referred to gender clinics have other challenges, and these are called comorbidities. A review of referrals across multiple countries concluded, quote, these children show higher than expected levels of ASD, ADHD, anxiety, depression, eating disorders, suicidality, self-harm, and ACEs, end quote. For instance, researchers in Finland found that more than 3/4 of the referred adolescent population needed specialist child and adolescent psychiatric support due to problems other than gender dysphoria, many of which were severe, predated, and were not considered to be secondary to the gender dysphoria, end quote. Meanwhile, studies have found that trans-identifying people are 3 to 6 times more likely to be autistic than their peers. I mean, Mark, these are shocking numbers. And for doctors and medical professionals to know this and to be running trials and tests and experiments and to discount that these types of mental, psychosexual comorbidities that exist are like, we don't need to take that into consideration. I mean, unethical in the first place. But, I mean, don't these medical professionals have some kind of standard of care that they need to uphold in their profession. I mean, this is just absolutely crazy for me.
One would hope. The report said young people referred to gender services are also disproportionately likely to have gone through, quote, adverse childhood experiences. For instance, studies have found that about half of all kids referred for gender services had been affected by maternal mental illness or substance abuse, while almost a quarter had been exposed to domestic violence. The bottom line, George, many trans-identifying youth have mental health challenges aside from their gender dysphoria, and these other needs are often neglected.
And that's the issue here, parents. We have known this. We have been questioning this. We have asked this all along. In fact, if you go back to one of our past episodes where we went through the detailed review of Abigail Schreier's book, Irreversible Damage, she talks about a lot of this stuff, and she's been questioning it, but it's just been brushed aside as if it's not a big deal. So we're going to continue really staying on this point, even though we're going to spend a little bit probably more time than usual, but this is important. And the reason why we want to remain on this point and bring to you what other things from the CASS report is because more often than not, in a school boardroom, whenever there's a policy that wants to be passed, this is the point that they're making. They are basically saying that we, parents, are trying to withhold life-saving, medicine or solutions from these kids. And so now they attack us as basically wanting to kill children. So parents, I know it's hard to stand up in front of a boardroom with, teacher union, cronies in the audience, shouting and hissing and doing all of their drama. But all of the evidence is on our side. We know that there is something else happening with this population of children. So let's talk a little bit more about this. When it comes to suicidal ideation and attempts, the rates among trans-identifying youth are higher than in the general population. So why is that? Is it because the transphobic population is causing them to be suicidal? No. But rather than this being driven by lack of societal acceptance for trans people or failure to provide, quote, gender-affirming medicines, as is often claimed, it is largely accounted for by the other mental health challenges that these kids are going through. A recent study looking at international data reviewed all gender clinic-referred adolescents between 1996 and 2019. So this is a look into 2,083 cases and compare them to age-matched controls. They compare them against 16,643. The study found that although the suicide rate in the gender-referred youth was higher than in the general population, this difference leveled out when specialist-level mental health treatment was taken into account. Oh, this is the key. The CASS report concludes, overall, it is difficult to draw firm conclusions because the absolute risk of suicide in the population of gender dysphoric youth and in the control population was very low, so numbers were thankfully small. Mark, let's continue on this topic.
Yeah, so the popular narrative is that trans-identifying kids are suffering because they are trans, and that gender-affirming medicine coupled with society's acceptance will resolve their mental health challenges and ergo prevent them from committing suicide. But the truth, as found by the CASS report, is that many trans-identifying young people have mental health challenges aside from their gender dysphoria, and that these other needs are often, George, neglected. The CASS report concludes, quote, the evidence does not adequately support the claim that gender-affirming treatment reduces suicide risk. The charge that we hear over and over and over again. The data does not support it.
All right, so here comes, parents, the fourth and final major lessons learned from the CASS report. And that is that the exponential rise in trans identity is not explained by greater societal acceptance. In the last 15 years, both in the UK and across the Western world, that's key here, the Western world, the number of minors being referred to gender clinics has grown exponentially, and the male-female ratio has flipped. So pre the last 15 years, it was always prepubescent boys. In the last 15 years, it has flipped to postpubescent girls. Why? In the UK, in 2009, 15 female adolescents were referred to the UK's gender clinic and 24 adolescent males. But in 2016, 1,071 adolescent females and 426 adolescent males were referred. Indeed, from 2014, referral rates to GIDS, G-I-D-S, began to increase at an exponential rate, with the majority of referrals being birth-registered females presenting in early teenage years. By 2022, GIDS was receiving more like 5,000 referrals, though poor record keeping makes it hard to say exactly. So the CASS report notes that greater societal acceptance is a common explanation put forward to explain this increase in referrals. But while there is clearly much greater acceptance of trans identities, particularly among younger generations, the exponential change in referrals over a particularly short 5-year time frame is very much faster than would be expected for normal evolution of acceptance for a minority group. Moreover, the report observes that greater societal acceptance does not adequately explain the switch from birth-registered males to birth-registered females, which is unlike trans presentations in prior historical period. So what has driven this exponential growth and the switch from boys to girls, Mark?
Well, the CASS report notes that, quote, peer influence, big surprise here, during this stage of life is very powerful. It points to the influence of social media on trans-identifying kids and the evidence that social media is associated with a range of mental health challenges. Again, big surprise here, George. A systematic review of 20 studies found that the use of social media was associated with body image concerns and disordered eating. Numerous other studies implicate smartphone and social media use in mental distress and suicidality among young people, particularly girls, with a clear close response relationship. That is, the more hours spent online, the greater the effect. In addition to the influence of social media, the review has heard accounts of female students forming in friendships with other gender questioning or transgender students at school and then identifying as trans themselves. George, this was exactly the same point that Abigail Schreier made in her book, Irreversible Damage.
Yeah, and she based a lot of her evidence on another doctor, Dr. Lisa Lippman from Brown University. And when that report was published in late 2018, I still remember when it came out, they were trying to cancel Dr. Lippman. In fact, Brown University put out a statement basically telling Dr. Lippman to remove her report that was published. She stuck to her guns and she made some tweaks to the executive summary. But thankfully, that report is still available and widely referenced here in the United States. But here we are now 6 years later for the CASS report out of England to basically be telling us the same thing.
And the same thing happened with Abigail Schreier. In fact, Amazon deplatformed her book, Irreversible Damage, for a time. Well, the timeline for the explosion of trans identity among young people in the West supports the hypotheses that social media has played a key role. In the UK, quote, the recorded prevalence of gender dysphoria in people aged 18 and under increased, get ready, George, over 100-fold between 2009 and 2021, the report notes.
So ultimately, here's what we have as a conclusion on this point. The timeline for the explosion of trans identity among young people in the West supports the hypothesis that social media has played a key role. It's in large part due to social media, especially on Gen Z and especially on girls, and it's encouraged adolescents to attribute their loneliness, their depression, their anxiety to a mismatch between their true identity and their sexed bodies. So where do we go from here? What do we do with all of this information? Well, surprisingly, writing for The Atlantic, journalist Helen Lewis calls the CASS report, quote, a model for the treatment of fiercely debated social issues, nuanced, empathetic, evidence-based, and observes that it has taken a political debate and returned it to the realm of provable facts. In fact, Mark, there was an op-ed that was published in the New York Times about the CASS report, which we don't have the time to get into right now. But I was shocked that the New York Times would allow an op-ed to be published that was very favorable towards the findings of the CASS report.
Well, we said at the outset of actually part one of this broadcast that the CASS report has the potential of serving as the tipping point in this conversation that we're having over gender-affirming care, and hopefully, George, that proves true.
So, parents, that's all the time we have for today, but we encourage you to go and to read the report, read at least the first 10 pages with all of its recommendations. Even though it is, technically jargon heavy, but I believe that the first 10 pages most people will understand. I think they did a good job of bringing it to the common man's language. And so parents, start using this report to support the kind of policies that get passed at the local school board. But also, I'm sure that this will help us pass much better policies at the state and federal level. So thank you for listening to our Say What podcast. Please go and visit us at protectourkidsnow.org. We've actually simplified our website now. You can just go to POK.org. Share this with your friends and with your families elsewhere. What we are talking about here is not just about California or about some blue state. It is in all 50 states. This is a battle that parents must wage everywhere.
You've been listening to Say What, the radio ministry of Protect Our Kids, where they seek to inform and equip concerned citizens about the crisis in American public education and the forces working against our children. Join us at this same time every Saturday as attorney Mark Schneider and Pastor George Rosca Jr. unpack the issues so that we can better safeguard our nation's children. For more information about this program or Protect Our Kids, email the show at info@protectourkidsnow.org. That's info@protectourkidsnow.org. And join Mark and George right here next week at this same time for another episode of Say What.